The House of Commons didn't just erupt today, it detonated. But not because of chaos, not because of shouting, and not because of anger. It exploded because of confidence. Calm, razor-sharp, perfectly timed confidence. Pierre Poilievre walked into Parliament convinced he'd corner Mark Carney, the newly elected Prime Minister who had been painted by his rivals as too polished, too academic, too cautious. Poilievre came armed with numbers, outrage, and a camera-ready smirk, but what he met instead was a masterclass in composure. Carney didn't yell, he didn't bite, he waited, and when he finally spoke, he didn't argue, he taught. What followed wasn't a debate, it was an education. A political schooling so devastating that the entire chamber broke into laughter, applause, and disbelief. By the end of the session, Poilievre wasn't attacking anymore, he was reacting. And Carney wasn't defending, he was defining. This is how the balance of power shifted, one sentence at a time. This is how Mark Carney proved that control can be louder than chaos. It started like every other fiery session in the House of Commons. Pierre Poilievre rose from his seat with the confidence of a man certain he'd seize the spotlight. His voice boomed across the chamber, rehearsed and righteous, filled with outrage about grocery bills, rent hikes, and a prime minister out of touch with reality. He painted himself as the defender of the working class, the man who speaks for the people. But the rhythm felt predictable, like a song Canadians had heard one too many times. Across the aisle, Mark Carney sat silent, head slightly tilted, eyes fixed, calm to the point of unnerving. He didn't shuffle papers or whisper to aides, he just waited. Poilievre's speech gathered steam. Inflation out of control, food bank lines growing, coffee prices up 41%, seniors choosing between eating and heating. The attack was emotional, deliberate, and carefully crafted to provoke a reaction. But Carney didn't blink. His composure itself became an act of defiance. Where Poilievre's voice trembled with passion, Carney's stillness became louder than any outburst. It wasn't arrogance, it was anticipation. The Prime Minister's silence drew the tension tighter, second by second, until even the air in the chamber seemed to pause. Poilievre hurled one last jab, mocking Carney as a costly, out-of-touch economist lecturing hungry Canadians. He expected fury. Instead, he got a faint smile. Then slowly, deliberately, Mark Carney stood. He buttoned his jacket, cleared his throat, and faced the speaker. The room fell silent, every camera, every MP, every eye waiting for the comeback. And then, with a tone colder than steel and sharper than wit, Carney began, "Mr. Speaker, it's time once again for our economic lesson." The explosion that followed would echo far beyond that chamber. The instant those words left Carney's mouth, "Mr. Speaker, it's time once again for our economic lesson," the entire House shifted. It wasn't what he said, it was how he said it. Calm, controlled, a professor in a room full of hecklers. The benches behind him erupted in laughter, but Carney didn't even smirk. He stood there, unshaken, letting silence do the talking before delivering the most composed takedown Parliament had seen in years. He began with precision. Inflation is down, growth is steady, our deficit the lowest in the G7. No theatrics, no spin, just numbers layered one after another like the slow tightening of a vice. Poilievre's expression started to falter. His usual grin froze somewhere between confusion and disbelief. This wasn't the fiery back and forth he'd rehearsed. This was surgical humiliation. Then came the strike that sealed the moment. We promised to cut taxes, they're cut. We promised to cut the carbon tax. It's cut, you weren't here. The timing was flawless. The House burst into laughter and applause so loud it drowned out Poilievre's attempt to respond. The jab, subtle, clever, devastating, reminded everyone of the opposition leader's own political defeat. Carney didn't raise his voice. He didn't gloat. He simply waited for the noise to settle, then continued, "We promise to build this country strong. November 4th, this House will have a choice. Are you with us for those single mothers? Are you with us for those farmers?" It wasn't just a rebuttal, it was a declaration, a turning point. For once, the loudest man in Parliament wasn't winning the room, the calmest was. By the time Carney sat down, the energy had flipped entirely. Poilievre had thrown punches, Carney had rewritten the script. Desperate to regain momentum, Poilievre did what he always does best, he went for emotion. He slammed his papers down and accused the Prime Minister of denying hidden liberal taxes on groceries. He quoted the so-called food professor, waving his notes like proof of a grand conspiracy. His words grew sharper, faster, angrier, farmers paying more for steel, fertilizer, and fuel, Canadians suffering under the weight of liberal arrogance. It was classic Poilievre, provoke, exaggerate, repeat. But this time his fire hit a wall of ice. Carney stood again, slower than before, as if savoring the silence that followed Poilievre's outburst. Then came that measured voice, the kind that doesn't shout because it doesn't need to. "Mr. Speaker," he said evenly, "I'm going to quote independent research, the Canadian Climate Institute. It finds that the net impact of the industrial carbon tax on food prices is, on average, 0%. He paused. Look directly across the aisle. Wait for it, zero. Laughter erupted, echoing through the chamber like thunder. Even journalists couldn't hide their smirks. For a moment, politics gave way to comedy, the kind that cuts deeper than any insult. Carney had done the unthinkable. He turned a hostile debate into a teachable moment. Poilievre's face tightened. His signature smirk disappeared. His emotional performance, built on outrage, collapsed under the weight of a single statistic. Carney didn't just answer a question, he dismantled a narrative. He showed that data, when delivered with precision and timing, could be more devastating than any shouting match. The room's energy flipped once again. The economic lesson had become a political one. Emotion fades, but facts endure. And this time the lesson wasn't for the public, it was for Pierre Poilievre himself. Just when everyone thought the exchange couldn't get any more explosive, the topic shifted from inflation to industry, from taxes to jobs. Poilievre tried a new angle, one he thought might finally rattle the Prime Minister. He accused Carney of failing Canada's auto workers, pointing to Stellantis shifting part of its operations to the United States. His tone grew sharp, rehearsed outrage spilling over. He promised a deal by July, he failed. He promised to protect our auto sector, and now it's being dismantled before our eyes. Carney leaned back unbothered. But before he could even respond, another voice sliced through the noise, powerful, steady, and unmistakably confident. Industry Minister Mélanie Joly stood up. The room quieted. When it comes to the auto workers, she began, they know that we have their back and that we will fight for every single job in this country. The conviction in her tone turned heads. She wasn't reading from notes. She was speaking from the gut. Joly reminded Parliament that Canadian automakers were not collapsing, they were transforming. EV plants opening, supply chains evolving, global companies investing billions. You know why, she said, voice rising just enough to command the floor. Because Canadian auto workers are the best in the world. Applause thundered. Even those who disagreed couldn't deny it. This was leadership in motion. Poilievre tried to interject, but Joly's voice cut through his interruption like a blade. We'll hold every corporation accountable. We're building an industry that lasts. Carney didn't need to add a word. He simply nodded, proud, measured, letting his minister's fire become his finishing move. For the first time that day, it wasn't just Carney teaching a lesson. It was his team showing what real unity looks like. By now, the tension in Parliament had shifted completely. What began as Poilievre's attack had turned into a slow, painful unraveling of his own strategy. The man who had built his image on confidence and control was suddenly grasping for rhythm, repeating talking points that no longer landed. Each sentence sounded louder but weaker. The energy that once electrified his base now echoed like static in a room where everyone had stopped listening. He doubled down, listing prices again, coffee up 41%, meat up 14%, groceries through the roof, as if the repetition itself could fill the silence. But the numbers had lost their sting. Carney had already neutralized them with facts, and Joly had already grounded the discussion in reality. Poilievre's fury felt misplaced, almost theatrical, a man yelling at a wall that refused to echo back. Carney sat quietly, occasionally jotting notes, the faint trace of a smile playing on his face. He didn't need to interrupt. He didn't even need to respond. The contrast between them said it all: chaos versus composure, noise versus nuance. And Canadians watching from home saw it too. Social media lit up instantly. Carney isn't arguing, he's educating. Poilievre's yelling at the calmest man in the country. This is what leadership looks like. For years, people had accused Carney of being too polished, too cautious, too detached. But today, that restraint became his greatest strength. He didn't just survive Poilievre's performance, he outclassed it entirely. When the opposition leader finally slumped back into his seat, his usual grin gone, Carney leaned toward the microphone and said softly, "We're here to build, not to blame." It was quiet. Too quiet because everyone knew that was the knockout line. By the time Carney rose again, the chamber had fallen into a strange kind of silence, not out of boredom but out of awe. Every eye was fixed on him. Even his critics, who moments earlier had been whispering among themselves, leaned in. They were watching something rare, a leader who understood not just politics but timing. Carney wasn't improvising, he was orchestrating. Every pause, every phrase, every glance across the aisle was deliberate. He started slow, building rhythm. We promised to cut taxes for every Canadian. 22 million people have already seen their taxes lowered. We promised to make homebuilding easier. Those permits are being cut. We promised to cut the carbon tax. It's been done. Then he leaned forward and added, "You weren't here." Laughter rippled through the house again, but this time it wasn't mockery, it was respect disguised as humor. Carney's composure turned the chamber into a classroom, and he was the professor no one dared interrupt. He ended with a challenge that felt more like a mission statement than a sound bite. We promise to build this country strong. On November 4th, this House will have a choice. Will you stand with us for those single mothers, those farmers, those families who are working to keep this country moving? In one moment, the debate stopped feeling like politics and started feeling like leadership. Even Poilievre couldn't hide his discomfort. The smirk that had once carried him through tough exchanges was gone, replaced by quiet frustration. Carney had done more than win an argument, he'd redefined the tone of the room. What began as a brawl had turned into a masterclass in control. Parliament had seen many speakers before, but none who commanded silence like this one. The aftermath was instant. Within minutes of Carney's closing words, clips flooded social media. TikTok, YouTube, and X lit up with the same moment, that calm, cutting line. "You weren't here." It became the soundbite of the day, a rallying cry for supporters and a warning shot for opponents. In Parliament, the mood had already changed, but online, the reaction turned seismic. Comments poured in from Canadians who had grown numb to the noise of politics. "Finally, someone speaking like an adult," one wrote. Another added, "Carney's not debating, he's educating the whole room." Even neutral viewers admitted it, the performance was something different. It wasn't bluster, it was precision. News outlets ran headlines calling it a parliamentary masterclass. Editorials praised Carney's restraint, his humor, his intellect, all the things critics once mocked him for. The man they said couldn't connect emotionally had just made an entire country feel proud. Meanwhile, Poilievre's usual media echo chamber fell silent. His fiery clips, once viral, were overshadowed by Carney's calm demolition. Instead of trending for his talking points, Poilievre was trending for being outclassed. Memes showed him mid-sentence frozen while captions read, "Lesson learned." But beyond the memes, something deeper was happening. Canadians were seeing a shift not just in tone but in leadership. The anger, the shouting, the constant finger-pointing suddenly looked small compared to Carney's quiet authority. For the first time in years, Parliament didn't feel like a circus. It felt like a country's mind waking up. And in that transformation, a new truth emerged sometimes. Strength isn't about volume or vengeance. Sometimes it's about knowing when to pause and letting the silence speak louder than the scream. When the gavel finally struck and the chamber emptied, the message lingered like an echo, not of anger, but of authority. Mark Carney had done more than survive another round of political theater. He'd rewritten the rules of engagement. In an era where shouting matches dominate headlines, he'd reminded Canadians that calm isn't weakness, it's strategy. Pierre Poilievre came to Parliament expecting another shouting contest. Instead, he found himself debating a man who played an entirely different game. Carney didn't counter with rage or ridicule. He used logic, timing, and subtle humor, the three weapons most politicians forget exist. He spoke with the ease of someone who didn't need to prove himself, only to lead. And when Mélanie Joly stood by his side, fierce and unapologetic, it wasn't just a debate anymore, it was a statement. A new tone had entered Canadian politics. One built on reason, not rage. One that made populism look small in comparison to professionalism. Across Canada, viewers saw something they hadn't in years: dignity in leadership. It wasn't about perfection, it was about composure under fire. Carney had shown that the best comeback isn't the loudest insult, it's the smartest answer. By the end of the day, Poilievre's attacks were forgotten, but Carney's calm still replayed on every screen. He didn't just win a debate, he earned a reputation. Because in politics, as in life, there's power in patience, strength in silence, and victory in restraint. And that's why, long after the applause faded, Canadians weren't talking about who yelled the loudest, they were talking about who led the best. This is Northern Pulse, where power meets perspective, and every silence tells a story louder than words. When the gavel finally struck and the chamber emptied, the message lingered like an echo, not of anger, but of authority. Mark Carney had done more than survive another round of political theater. He'd rewritten the rules of engagement. In an era where shouting matches dominate headlines, he'd reminded Canadians that calm isn't weakness, it's strategy. Pierre Poilievre came to Parliament expecting another shouting contest. Instead, he found himself debating a man who played an entirely different game. Carney didn't counter with rage or ridicule. He used logic, timing, and subtle humor, the three weapons most politicians forget exist. He spoke with the ease of someone who didn't need to prove himself, only to lead. And when Mélanie Joly stood by his side, fierce and unapologetic, it wasn't just a debate anymore, it was a statement. A new tone had entered Canadian politics. One built on reason, not rage. One that made populism look small in comparison to professionalism. Across Canada, viewers saw something they hadn't in years: dignity in leadership. It wasn't about perfection, it was about composure under fire. Carney had shown that the best comeback isn't the loudest insult, it's the smartest answer. By the end of the day, Poilievre's attacks were forgotten, but Carney's calm still replayed on every screen. He didn't just win a debate, he earned a reputation. Because in politics, as in life, there's power in patience, strength in silence, and victory in restraint. And that's why, long after the applause faded, Canadians weren't talking about who yelled the loudest, they were talking about who led the best. This is Northern Pulse, where power meets perspective, and every silence tells a story louder than words.